So in today's video, we're going to talk about two concepts. One is known as arrays. And the second is conditionals and loops, right? So now that we know a lot about the fundamental data structures and how to assign values to them and how to sort of create certain expressions and even run some basic math, what we need to learn now is how to collect fundamental data types into a structure called an array. So this syntax that you see up here, for example. Okay, so let's start. Let's actually create so what is an array? An array is a collection of elements of a particular data type, right? So we will only be operating on the fundamental data types. So let's start with an int. So when you want to create an int, you say int, you give it a name and you say a value, right? But when you want to create an array, the syntax is a little bit different. So for an array, you put the box brackets here, and here you can do one of two things. You can either create an array literal, right? Which means that you actually give the values you want to be included in this array literally, or another syntax that you can use is actually, you can say int b equals new int, right? And here what you could do is you could actually combine this with the literal syntax. So for example, I would say 10, 20, 30, right? Or another way of doing it is to say int c equals new int and give it the size. So let's say I say 3, right? What this means is that this has created an array of this. So this is read as C is an array of ints, and it is an array of how many ints? It is an array of 3 ints. So you could store 3 numbers in them. So how would you go about storing and getting values from an array, right? A simple way to think about it is basically you use an operator known as an index operator, which is basically the square brackets. So what you could say is you could say int c, you say c, since you've already given the int earlier, you don't need to do that. You say c0, array indexing always starts at 0. That means the first element is 0. And you could say this value is 45. Then you could say c1 and this value is 55. And then you can say c2 and this value is 65, right? Now what would happen if I try to say c3 and give that a value? Let's say 75, right? So if you notice here, I don't actually get any errors, but let's try to run this program and see what happens. Shift F10 to run. And if you notice in the error, you will get something that says this: exception in thread main java.lang. The key part here is array index out of bounds exception, right? And it tells you actually pretty clearly that line 13, which is this line, so if you clicked on it, you actually go there. Line 13 is the error, which is, and what is the error? I've said that C is an array of 3 ints, but what I've done here is I've assigned 4 ints to it, and the 4th int is actually in an index, so it's even highlighted by the IDE. So you could even mouse over it and it tells you this array index is out of bounds. That means this, you're trying to assign a value that is 75 to an array index which doesn't exist. It's kind of like trying to turn to a page in a book which doesn't exist because it's not in the index, right? So let's just get rid of that and get rid of the error and try to now print out some of the values that we've got, right? So let's say I want to print out the array element c2, right? So I'm going to say c2 equals to plus c2. Sorry, here we go. And let me run this. So you should get 65, right? Because why have I got 65? C2 means I want the third element, right? So this is one crucial thing that you've got to keep in mind when you're dealing with arrays in Java, right? Indexing starts at 0. That means the first element is 0. And this actually works the same for all of these arrays that I've created. So in fact, what we'll do is let's actually now try to print out elements, different elements of each of them. So let's say A0, just to prove that I'm going to get the first element. So I should get 1 over here, 0. And for the B1, let me try to print out B2. So let's say B1, right? I've already printed out 2 somewhere. So let me try printing out another element, right? So I'm going to say B1. Okay. So I should, so again, when you're doing these exercises and you're working along with the code video, what you should do is you should think what I should actually get here. So for example, A0, I expect to get 1. For B1, I expect to get 20. And for C2, I expect to get 65, right? So you form these sort of things in your head and then run the code and see whether you get the answers that you expect, right? And this is kind of how you can practice. So this is the way you create an array, right? And this, I will show you one more data type, but actually this works. This is the same no matter which data type you use. The syntax is always the same. So for example, let's do it with double, right? So I'm going to say double, put the array D is equal to, and I'm going to use the array literal here. So I'm going to say 1.5 comma 2.5, right? And then let me print out D0. So D0 is equal to plus D0, right? So let me do this. And now you see you've got the array element D0, right? So this is basically how you work with arrays, right? Once you've created an array, you cannot change the current array size, right? All you can do is you can actually create a new array, but you can't create you can't change the array size as it were. It's fixed. Okay, so just keep in mind that there are three different ways or syntaxes for creating arrays. One is this literal syntax, which is you put these curly brackets. One is using a new expression, something called a new expression, where you say new and then you give the data type, but you don't actually give the number of elements. That is, the Java will determine the number of elements automatically by looking at this literal. And the third is where you actually give the number of elements, but in this case, it actually the values that they have are not interesting to you. So you will then manually assign elements to the arrays. Okay, so now that we know this, one of the simplest things we can do is do things which are, for example, called loops. Okay, so let's see that next. So now we're going to do loops, right? So what are loops? Loops are ways of actually looping through a data structure. So in this case, let's say an array, for example, where you can get each element of the array and print it out or work with it using whatever mathematical operation you want, right? So let's say, for example, I wanted to sum all the elements in this array, right? So now I've given it elements. So what I can do is something known as a for each loop. So I can say for, and you see Java actually the IDE completes it for you. All this says is, now you know that this is an array of int. So you could say int x, right? And I'll just format this a little bit better. And here I'm going to say C, right? And within the body, I can sort of do something. So I can say S out, and I can say print this value, right? Sorry, print the value X. So what is happening here is, when you read this in English, the way it works is, for every element X that exists in C, print out X, right? So here, if I run this, you'll see it's printed out 45, 55, 65, right? So here I didn't have to actually bother. So why is this loop such a good idea? I don't have to now bother about whether when I do this access, I'm going to overstep or sort of overflow or get out of the bounds of the array, right? Java will make sure that it will call this function only 3 times. Why? Because this array C has only 3 elements in its array, right? Another way of doing a loop is a more traditional one from the C programming language, which is basically for. Now you start off with an index. So you say for int I equals 0, right? You start off with a condition where you say I is less than c dot length, and then you increment, right? So you say I plus plus. So let me just get this in and do it, and then I'll run it, and then I'll explain how it works. Okay, so I'm going to say ci. Okay, so this should actually also do the same thing as the loop above. So if you notice here again, this is coming from this loop, right? So let's try and understand what this loop is doing. So in this for loop, what you've done is you've created an int variable called I, which is sort of acting as an index. Okay, and what you do here is you say I want to start at index 0 and make sure that I increment this index. Okay, not I increment this index, and when this index's value is less than the length of the array, right, only then should you run this code, right? So what that means is in this case also, so actually why does Java have these two ways of doing it? Sometimes you may not want to print out or work with every single element of an array. You may actually, let's make this array a little bit bigger, right? So let's work with B, for example, or since we've got A, which is a big array, let's use that one, right? So I'm going to change this C here to A, and don't worry why I call this a.length, that I will explain later on in another video. Okay, so I'm going to print this out and you'll see 1 to 5, but let's say I don't want to print out every single element. I only want to print out from here 2, 3 and 4, right? So the second element, the index is 1, so I would increment this and I would just change this to 1, and rather than say a.length, I would say, so this is 0th element, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to print out till 3, right? So I'm going to say I less than 4, right? And now let's try and print this out. So here you've got only the values 2, 3 and 4, right? So in this way, these loops basically sort of help you to kind of, instead of doing it manually, these loops kind of help you. So another way is, let's say you wanted to assign values to an array, right? So in this case, I wanted to change the values of 2, 3 and 4 to something else, right? So what I could have done here is I could have said A and I equals, and this time let's say I want to get the value that's currently in AI, that is whatever value it is, and square it. So I'm going to multiply it by itself, right? So let's try and do this, and then at the end of it, let's do the for each int x in A, and let's print this out, right? X. So now if you notice, the elements in the array, the first one was untouched, the second one, which was 2, has now become 4, The third one, which is 3, has now become 9. And the fourth one, which was 4, has now become 16. And the fifth one was untouched, because if you look at this loop, it's stopping before you reach the end. So the fourth one was the end. If I wanted to include the last element, I would have said 5 here, right? But I actually said 4. So in this basically shows you that both these loops are actually fairly important, right? When you are working with things like arrays, or even if you don't work with arrays, right, you can actually do things with this particular loop that you cannot do in this one. So this one requires you to either give it an array or what is known as a Java collection, which we'll learn about much later. Whereas this loop doesn't even need an array. So for example, I could have said for int I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus, okay, and I could say print out I, okay. So it'll actually just print out the numbers from 0 to 9, right? Because I said when I is less than 10, so the value the int just before 10 is 9. So it actually prints this out, right? In this case, there is no use of an array. And many times whenever you want to execute a particular sort of a particular code statement or many statements, what will happen is you will end up doing it in a for loop like this, so that it gives you that repetition, okay. And just to button this up, what is this I plus plus? Plus plus is an operator which increments the value which is in I. So like I told you, when I starts out initially, it is 0. Then Java will compare this value to this condition. Is 0 less than 10 true? Then it will execute this statement. Then after it executes the statement and comes to the end, it doesn't go further. It actually then goes back and increments I. So I was initially 0. Now it increments it to 1. Then it checks 1. Is 1 less than 10? Yes. Then it goes through this loop again, right? Sorry. Then it goes through this loop again, and so on and so forth, and it will do this 10 times until I actually becomes equal to 10. Then when I becomes equal to 10, it will compare this, and because it's false, 10 is not less than 10, it won't execute these statements, right? So therefore, when you run this, you don't see the value 10 here, right? So I think that should be kind of good enough in this video. I was planning to take out to sort of do more in this video, but I think it's good enough for now. I'll pick up the rest of the control statements and things like switch and while and everything in the next one. Okay, so see you in the next one. Thank you.